Allegheny Highlands, Pennsylvania, October 1878. When Lucas Brant began digging a trench down the center of his newly laid cabin floor, the community of Hemlock Creek thought he had lost his mind to the coming winter's chill before it had even arrived. Thomas Miller, a man who had raised more than 30 cabins in these hills and knew the unforgiving nature of its seasons, watched with a heavy heart. "The foundation's meant to keep the damp out, Lucas," he said, his voice laced with genuine concern. "Not to be a ditch for cold air to settle in. You're building a grave for the frost." But Lucas Brant wasn't building a cold trap. He was building a lung for his fire, a secret artery of warmth that would run silent and unseen beneath his family's feet. And when the great blizzard of '78 descended, a storm that would be spoken of for a generation, that foolish ditch would prove the difference between survival and desperation, a difference measured in 103 degrees. If you're fascinated by the kind of forgotten wisdom that allowed pioneers to thrive against impossible odds, subscribe to our channel. We uncover one of these lost techniques every week, showing how simple physics, not complex machinery, was the key to a better life. The mockery began not as a cruel storm, but as a slow, steady drizzle of doubt. It collected in the corners of the general store, in the quiet conversations between neighbors after Sunday service. Lucas Brant was an outsider, a Swiss immigrant who spoke with a thick German accent and whose hands, though strong, were stained with the memory of clay, not timber. In his homeland, he had not been a carpenter, but a potter and kiln maker, a man who understood the slow, radiating soul of baked earth. Here in Pennsylvania, surrounded by endless forests, that knowledge was seen as useless, even alien. Thomas Miller's criticism was the most respected, for it came from a place of experience. He saw the world in terms of tight joinery, seasoned logs, and a wide stone chimney that could draw smoke and swallow cords of oak. "A fire needs to breathe, yes," Miller explained to a group of men at the land agent's office, "but it breathes from the room. It pulls the cold air from the floor, warms it, and sends it up. That's the cycle. His plan. His plan invites the cold in from outside and buries the heat in the dirt. It's backward." He wasn't wrong, based on every cabin he had ever built or seen. His logic was sound, his experience vast. The problem wasn't his understanding of construction. The problem was that Lucas Brant wasn't building a conventional fireplace. He was building an engine. The second voice of skepticism belonged to Jebediah Jeb Stone, a man whose opinions were as common and hard as the rocks in his fields. He lacked Miller's technical nuance, replacing it with a sharp, memorable scorn. It was Jeb who, after watching Lucas meticulously lining his trench with flat stones, gave the strange construction its name. "Looks like Brant is burying a great big dirt serpent under his floor," he announced at the Mercantile, to the laughter of a half-dozen farmers. The name stuck. Brant's dirt serpent became a local phrase, a cautionary tale in the making, a monument to foolishness. The most painful criticism, however, came from within the family. Elspeth Brant's brother, Daniel, came to visit one crisp November afternoon. He was a practical man, a farmer who trusted what he could see and touch. He saw his sister, pregnant with their third child, living in a cabin with a bizarre, mud-filled trench bisecting the floor. He took Lucas aside, his voice low and earnest. "Lucas, people are talking. They say you're putting your family at risk for some old country notion. This isn't the Alps. The wind here has teeth you can't imagine. What will you do when the floor freezes up from that thing?" Lucas simply nodded, his quiet nature often mistaken for ignorance. "The fire will not freeze," he said, his English careful and deliberate. Later, Daniel spoke to his sister alone. "You know what this looks like? It looks like you don't trust your own work. It looks like fear." That night, Elsbeth felt the weight of it all. The whispers in town, the pitying looks, her own brother's fear for her children, Anna and Emil. She watched her husband by the dim lantern light carefully mixing clay, sand, and straw in a wooden trough. His movements were not frantic or fearful. They were patient, precise, like a baker kneading dough he had made 1,000 times. "It is hard to be the town story, Lucas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped his work and looked at her, his eyes clear. He didn't offer complex explanations or defensive arguments. He simply took her hand and placed it on the cool, damp clay mixture. "In my grandfather's kiln," he said softly, "the fire's heat was not for the sky. It was for the pots. It soaked into the stone, into the earth, and stayed for 2 days after the flame was gone. A chimney sends warmth to the crows. My floor will send it to our children." He wasn't speaking of fear, he was speaking of physics, a language he understood as intimately as his native tongue. In that moment, her faith in him, which had been battered by the community's certainty, was restored. She looked at the strange trench not as a symbol of their isolation, but as a vessel for his quiet confidence. She made her declaration, as much to herself as to him. "Winter will tell us what's wise and what's foolish." The final piece of the gauntlet was the quasi-official disapproval from Mr. Abernathy, the county land agent. During a routine visit to register the claim, he surveyed the unusual construction with a skeptical eye. "I've got the official building recommendations from the territorial government, Mr. Brandt," he said, tapping a leather-bound folio. "They specify a stone hearth of no less than 4 feet in width and a chimney with a flue cleared at least 2 feet above the roof line for safety and proper draw. This setup, it isn't in any manual I've seen." He made a note in his ledger, a small bureaucratic mark against the Brandt name. It carried no legal penalty, but it solidified their status as outliers, a family officially operating outside the bounds of accepted wisdom. Lucas Brandt paid them no mind. He continued his work, his focus absolute. The mockery lasted for 2 months. The validation would last for 100 winters. The genius of the dirt serpent was not in its materials, which were nothing more than the earth beneath the cabin, but in its radical understanding of heat itself. The settlers of Hemlock Creek understood fire as a source of direct, radiant heat. You stood near it to get warm. The heat you felt was the heat that mattered. Anything that went up the chimney was simply the price you paid for getting rid of the smoke. For Lucas Brandt, this was a profound waste. He saw the hot smoke and exhaust gases not as waste, but as the very lifeblood of the heat itself, a valuable resource to be harvested before it was given away to the winter sky. His work began with the trench. It was 18 inches deep and 18 inches wide, running a full 24 feet from the base of the hearth to the far wall of the cabin. He didn't just dig it, he shaped it. The bottom was lined with a tightly packed layer of gravel for drainage, and upon that, a bed of flat, heavy river stones. These were the foundation, the bones of the system. Then came the artery itself. Over several weeks, Lucas painstakingly formed a long, hollow tube of clay. It wasn't mere mud. It was a precise mixture he called lem, a composite of clay for plasticity, sand for thermal stability, and straw for tensile strength. He mixed it with his bare feet, working it until it had the perfect consistency. He formed it in sections over a wooden mold, letting each piece sun-dry before joining them with a wet slurry of the same material, creating a continuous, monolithic pipe, 8 inches in diameter. This was the dirt serpent, laid carefully upon the stone bed in the trench. Next, he redesigned the firebox. A standard fireplace is an open mouth, inhaling vast quantities of air from the room it is trying to heat. This creates a vicious cycle. The fire consumes the warm air, which is replaced by cold air sucked in through every crack and gap in the cabin walls, creating drafts that chill the very people huddled by the fire. It was a system that fought itself. Lucas's firebox was different. It was smaller, deeper, and fronted with a heavy iron door he had salvaged from a disused smith's forge. Crucially, it did not breathe from inside the house. Lucas had laid a small 3-inch clay pipe from the base of the firebox, running under the floor and terminating just outside the foundation wall. This was the fire's nostril. It inhaled the cold, dense outside air directly, leaving the warm, placid air inside the cabin untouched. The fire was a closed system, a guest in the house, not a ravenous tenant. The most counterintuitive part came next. The exhaust flue from this firebox did not go up. It went down. Lucas engineered the connection so that all the smoke and superheated gas was forced to exit downwards into the entrance of the long, subfloor clay pipe. This hot gas, unable to rise, was pushed horizontally along the entire length of the cabin, 24 feet through the buried dirt serpent. As it traveled, the immense heat was not lost to the sky. Instead, it radiated outwards, transferring its energy directly into the clay pipe, the surrounding stones, and the dense packed earth that Lucas backfilled into the trench around it. By the time the exhaust finally reached the far wall and was vented out a low, modest chimney no taller than a man, it was no longer scorching hot, but merely warm. The bulk of its thermal energy had been captured and stored in the massive earthen battery he had constructed beneath his floor. He then laid his floorboards over this system, leaving them raised just a half-inch higher than a normal floor to allow for air circulation. The cost of the entire system was negligible in terms of currency. He had traded weeks of his own methodical labor for what his neighbors spent on extra cords of wood and thicker wool blankets. He had invested in physics. The final element was the thermal mass of the hearth itself. It was built not of loose fieldstone, but of dense, soapstone-rich rocks he had located and hauled from a creek bed 2 miles away. Soapstone was legendary for its ability to absorb and slowly radiate heat. His hearth was not just a fireplace, it was a capacitor for warmth. One evening, before the floorboards were fully laid, he explained it to young Anna. He lit a small fire and let it burn for an hour. Then he extinguished it completely. He had her place her small hand on the clay pipe a good 10 feet from the firebox. Her eyes widened. It was warm. Not hot, but deeply, steadily warm. "The fire is sleeping," Lucas told her, "but its warmth is still working. It is trapped in the earth." They didn't see a complex system of thermodynamics and convective heat transfer. They saw a simple, magical truth. Their father had convinced the fire's warmth to stay long after the flames had died. He was not keeping the cold out, he was storing the heat in. The difference wasn't incremental, it was categorical. Stay with me because the numbers that came out of this cabin during the blizzard of '78 are going to change the way you think about a simple fire. They defied logic, precedent, and the combined wisdom of every builder in the Allegheny Highlands. If you believe this kind of practical ingenuity deserves to be remembered, take a moment to like this video. It helps us reach more people who appreciate the powerful lessons hidden in our history. The first snows of December were a prelude, a gentle warning. Then, on the 3rd week of January, 1878, the sky turned a flat, bruised gray, and the wind began to howl a song of pure malice. The great blizzard descended not in inches, but in feet. It came with a cold so profound it felt like a physical presence, an invading force that sought out every weakness, every poorly chinked log, every warped doorframe. For 2 days, the world disappeared into a churning vortex of white. Then the snow stopped, and the true enemy revealed itself, the temperature. It plunged to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, then minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and stayed there for 4 solid days. The cold didn't care about tradition. It cared about thermodynamics. Inside the cabin of Thomas Miller, the scene was one of grim, determined survival. Miller, his wife Sarah, and their 3 children were confined to the main room, huddled together under a mountain of quilts and buffalo robes. The fireplace, a magnificent structure of fieldstone that was the pride of his craft, roared with a desperate intensity. Thomas was feeding it constantly, using seasoned oak he had spent all summer splitting and stacking. Yet the warmth felt thin, a fragile shield against the siege. The outer walls were coated in a thick layer of frost. A bucket of water placed just 4 feet from the roaring fire had developed a skin of ice an inch thick. The convective loop he had described with such confidence was working against him. The fire's ravenous appetite for air was pulling the killing cold through the walls, creating a constant, invisible river of frigid air across the floor. They were warm on one side and freezing on the other. By the 3rd day, the woodpile just outside the door was dwindling at an alarming rate. Thomas knew he wouldn't have enough to last if the cold didn't break. He began to look around the room, his eyes falling on objects not for what they were, but for what they were worth in British thermal units: a broken chair, a stack of old planking. Then his gaze fell upon the cradle his own father had carved for his firstborn son. It was made of cherry wood, dark with age, its rockers worn smooth by a generation of use. The sight of it was a physical blow. Destroying it felt like burning a memory, an admission of profound failure. For hours he resisted, but as night fell and the temperature dropped even further, and he saw his youngest son's lips tinged with blue, his resolve broke. With a heavy heart and an apology to his ancestors, he dismantled the cradle and fed it piece by piece into the hungry flames. Each piece burned brightly, a fleeting burst of warmth against a cold that was winning. 500 yards away, across a landscape of sculpted white drifts, a different reality was unfolding inside the Brandt cabin. When the storm hit, Lucas secured the door and checked the flue vent. Then, he built a modest fire in his small, efficient firebox. He used small, seasoned lengths of hickory, adding 1 or 2 logs every 3 hours. The fire didn't roar. It hummed. A steady, controlled burn. There were no drafts. A candle placed on the floor near the door showed a flame that stood perfectly still, a testament to the sealed nature of the home. The air was calm, quiet, and warm. Not hot, not stuffy, but uniformly, pleasantly warm. Anna and Emil were not huddled under blankets. They were sitting on the floor in the center of the room, far from the fire, playing with carved wooden animals. They wore simple wool trousers and linen shirts. Elsbeth sat in her rocking chair, sewing, her feet flat on the floorboards. The warmth was not coming from the firebox. It was rising from the floor itself. It was a gentle, pervasive radiance that heated the objects and people in the room directly. The interior walls were cool to the touch, but not frosted. The single-pane window had a delicate lacework of frost at its edges, but the center was clear. In the far corner of the cabin, 20 feet from the hearth, a bucket of water was completely liquid. The temperature outside was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Lucas used a small, precious thermometer he had brought from Switzerland. The temperature inside was 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference was a staggering 90 degrees. His woodpile, a stack the same size as Miller's, was barely diminished. By the morning of the 4th day, the situation at the Miller cabin had become critical. A gust of wind had partially blocked his chimney, and smoke was now puffing back into the room, stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. The fire, which had consumed a family heirloom, was now a liability. The cold was no longer just a threat. It was inside, winning the war room by room. Thomas Miller was a proud man, a man whose identity was built on his competence and self-reliance. But he was also a father and a husband. He looked at his family's pale, drawn faces and made a decision that cost him more than his pride. He bundled himself in every layer he owned and stepped out into the brutal, crystalline air. The walk to the Brandt cabin was a battle against the wind and the deep, powdery snow. Each breath was a sharp pain in his lungs. He approached the small, unremarkable cabin, expecting to see a chimney belching smoke, a sign of a desperate, roaring fire within. He saw only a thin, lazy wisp of vapor rising from the low vent pipe. His heart sank. He feared he was too late. He knocked on the door, his knuckles numb. Elsbeth opened it. A silent, solid wave of warmth washed over him, so dense and enveloping it was like stepping into a different season. The air didn't move. It was just warm. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom of his own smoky cabin, took a moment to adjust. He saw the two children playing on the floor, their cheeks rosy and healthy. He saw Lucas sitting at a small table, mending a leather strap. There was no urgency, no fear, just a profound and baffling peace. He took a half step inside, and the most confusing sensation of all registered. The warmth wasn't hitting his face from the direction of the fire. He could feel it radiating up through the thick leather soles of his boots. The floor itself was warm. He stood there, a giant of a man covered in snow, the frigid wind swirling in behind him, utterly speechless. All his theories, all his experience, all his confident pronouncements at the general store turned to ash in his mind. He had burned his past to survive a single night. Lucas had used mud and stone to create a haven. The difference wasn't subtle. It was a chasm. Thomas Miller looked past Elsbeth to Lucas. The words of apology, of concession, died in his throat. They were inadequate. He was a builder. He understood things by their making. He stripped off his frozen mittens, his mind racing to reverse engineer the impossible comfort he was feeling. He saw no drafts, smelled no smoke, heard no roaring fire. He saw only the result. He finally looked at Lucas, not with pity or scorn, but with the raw, desperate curiosity of a student who has just discovered his master. His admission was not in words, but in a request that conceded everything. He stood there for a long moment, the silence broken only by the quiet hum of the fire. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse. "Silence. Show me how you built it." The thaw that followed the great blizzard was both physical and social. As the snow melted under a strengthening February sun, so too did the community's skepticism. Thomas Miller became Lucas Brandt's most unlikely and powerful advocate. He did not do it with speeches. He did it with action. The day after the storm broke, he returned to the Brandt cabin not with questions, but with tools, a thermometer and a measuring tape. He spent 2 hours methodically recording the data. The floor temperature directly above the flue, 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The floor temperature in the corner, 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The air temperature at ankle height, 66 degrees Fahrenheit. The air temperature near the ceiling, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The numbers were astounding. In his own cabin, the floor was a frigid 38 degrees Fahrenheit, while the air at the ceiling could be 80 degrees Fahrenheit, a uselessly stratified heat that left the living space cold. Miller didn't just measure, he observed. He saw the astonishingly small amount of wood Lucas used in a 24-hour period, less than a quarter of what his own inefficient fireplace consumed. He understood. The dirt serpent wasn't just a heater. It was a revolution in efficiency. At the next town meeting, the atmosphere was thick with talk of the storm, of lost livestock, dwindling woodpiles, and families who had spent days in a single, crowded room. Jeb Stone, unaware of Miller's conversion, tried to make a joke. "Well, I reckon old Brant's dirt serpent froze solid like everything else," he said, looking for a laugh. The room fell silent as Thomas Miller stood up. He was not a man given to public speaking, but his words carried the weight of unmatched authority in matters of construction. "I spent the worst night of that storm in Lucas Brant's cabin," he said, his voice clear and steady. "My family was freezing. His was warm. I brought my thermometer. I measured twice." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "I was wrong. Completely wrong. What he has built, it works." Coming from Miller, the admission was an earthquake. It wasn't an opinion, it was a fact, certified by the most respected builder in the county. The mockery died in that moment, replaced by a wave of intense, practical curiosity. The dirt serpent was no longer a joke. It was a solution. That spring, the silent adoption began. Miller, swallowing his pride, was the first to ask for Lucas's help. Together, they dug a trench in Miller's own floor. Two other families, who had nearly lost their newborn to the cold, followed suit. Lucas never charged $1 for his knowledge. He shared it freely, teaching them how to mix the lame, how to shape the firebox, how to understand the movement of heat as a patient, harvestable force. By the winter of 1879, 7 cabins in Hemlock Creek had Brant floors. By 1885, there were over 50 in the surrounding counties. The innovation spread not through pamphlets or salesmen, but through the quiet testimony of families who were warmer, safer, and burning a fraction of the wood. The name Dirt Serpent was forgotten, replaced by a term of respect, the Swiss hearth. Lucas Brant had, without knowing it, independently recreated the principles of a Roman hypocaust, a system of underfloor heating used by engineers 2,000 years before him. He had also anticipated the principles of the modern masonry heater and rocket stove by centuries, all through an intuitive, hands-on understanding of thermal mass and efficient combustion. His innovation was a perfect example of how old-world knowledge, applied to a new-world problem, could outperform established tradition. It was a reminder that the most powerful solutions are often not about adding more, but about wasting less. The story of the Brant floor became a quiet legend, a piece of local wisdom that demonstrated a profound truth of the frontier. Survival was not a matter of clinging to what was known, but of being willing to test what was not. It rewarded what worked, not what was conventional. The harshest winters were the most honest judges, and their verdicts were absolute, written not in ink, but in the simple, undeniable comfort of a child, sleeping soundly in a warm room. True wisdom, it turns out, doesn't always announce itself with a loud voice. Sometimes it travels silently, just beneath the surface, radiating a warmth that speaks for itself. A wise man doesn't fight the winter. He invites its enemy, the earth's own warmth, to stay for supper. If you'd like to see more stories about the forgotten geniuses of the frontier, please subscribe and let us know in the comments what you found most surprising about this technique. We'd love to hear from you. Disclaimer: this story is a fictionalized dramatization inspired by historical building techniques. The characters and specific events are products of imagination, but the engineering principles of thermal mass, radiant floor heating, and efficient combustion are very real. Always consult with professional engineers and adhere to modern building codes for any construction project.